Well, thank you very much. And my name is Lakshman Dattpan. I'm based in Nepal. I would like to thank International Internship University for this
Now,
opportunity.
please. Now you begin. Now.
Oh, okay. We live.
We are live.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon from Nepal, and good evening and good morning to all audience watching us virtually in the Facebook Live of the program organized by International Internship University. Let me take this opportunity to thank International Internship University for inviting me as the resource persons to talk about safety of journalists and the ethical standards of media at the global level, but I would definitely be sharing some insights on part of the South Asia and Southeast Asia. Before I go through my presentation, I would like to introduce the International Internship University, which is the world's first internship-based virtual university, building a better and brighter future for all young learners, and is committed to provide quality, accessible, affordable, skill-based, and location-independent education to learners across the world. And I think this is part of the university that we have been communicating to the world audience through our experience and insights. The International Internship University is providing access to more than 1,000 plus courses and internships to their e-learners across the globe with the team of high caliber and experienced global educators. IIU has been accredited and affiliated with the World Education Organization and International Accreditation Organization, and collaborated with all the world's top universities and educational institutions through the platform of massive open online courses. We must give credit to its founders. IIU provides various certificates and diploma courses, and there is always that one person who has the vision that thought the idea behind a successful venture and organization. And if we talk about the man behind the success of this university, is none other than a co-founder of IIU, Mr. Piyush Pandit. He concocted the world's first virtual internship university during a pandemic, the International Internship University, in short known as the IIU. With this very brief introduction of the International Internship University that has been reaching out to the global audience through different programs offered virtually, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Lakshman Dattpan. I am based in Nepal. I work with the Media Action Nepal, Nepal's media freedom and safety organization working for the promotion of free media and accountable media. Is also the member of the Media Freedom Coalition Consultative Network in the capacity of the co-chair of that network. I am also serving to the global media fraternity through protection of media rights. But at the same time, I also teach at one of the reputed universities in Georgia, Tbilisi State University, under the Erasmus Plus program. I have been teaching to the master's degree students of media psychology program, where I particularly teach media ethics in the global digital age, focusing on the safety measures that could be taken for the promotion of free and accountable media. But I have been into the field of communication and journalism for more than 2 decades, worked with some of the United Nations organizations, UN agencies here in Nepal, and have been contributing to national and international organizations through my insights, particularly on communication strategies, the role of media, interconnecting media's role to different fields. And today, through this presentation, I will particularly be discussing about media ethics and safety of journalists, the interconnection between these two very interesting terminology anyone would be interested to know about. I would again like to thank International Internship University for this opportunity to share my insights, my observations. I have been into research field as well. I have contributed with half a dozen journal chapters, book chapters and journal articles to international journals published by reputed journals across the world, but also focusing research work of in the media field in South Asia and Southeast Asian countries. With this very brief note about myself, the work I do and the organizations I am affiliated with, I'd like to start with a very general observation about how media ethics and safety of journalists could be understood and why these two interconnected issues matter not only to the journalist, but to the very well-being of a democratic world. Please allow me to share my slides. I will try to be very brief. And yes, I think I'm visible. Thank you for being with me. As I informed earlier, I will be focusing on two interconnected issues, media ethics and press freedom. Very dear, very closer terminologies to anyone across the world, journalist or non-journalist, representing any professions. Often people talk about media not being credible, media not being ethical, media not disseminating information, respecting their ethical standards and all. This is a very common phenomenon across the world. We often see in coffee shop gossips and elsewhere that media do not take care of their responsibilities. And with the advent of internet technology, the online media outlets, now, there are questions about the content that media in a day-to-day basis disseminates to the public, especially that of the disinformation and misinformations. Large group of people have been impacted by the information that has, not appropriately processed. That is one criticism about the media, despite the fact that media has contributed to the well-being of every individual across the world. The second part in my presentation is related to press freedom. And through this presentation, I will focus on why the issue of safety of journalists, press freedom matters to not only to journalists, but rest of citizens, global mass. And I'm focusing on approaches to upholding ethical journalism. What is your role? What is my role? What is journalist role actually promoting or upholding ethical journalism, ethical media content in this, the idea of global village. And also I will provide you with some insights alongside my engagement with the national and international organizations. But of course, I'm not representing any organization here as such. Overcoming global threats to media. Why should journalists remain safe? And when journalists are safe, actually democracy remains safe, our societies remain safe. So let me go ahead with the overview of my presentation today, very brief presentation. We'll talk about some key terms relating to media ethics, self-regulation, and the issue of accountability and credibility in media, irrespective of any socio-political and global phenomenon relating to media outlets operating in any environment. We'll also discuss about how media ethics is defined. There are different nomenclatures, there are different terminologies and disciplines interconnecting media ethics and safety of journalists. I will touch on that. Then I'm going to discuss about why does safety of journalists matter to you as an individual, not only to journalists and media outlets. And I'll provide you with some ways overcoming safety challenges that in a global world, the world is suffering with a lot of challenges, problems alongside natural disasters, COVID-19, the post-pandemic situation at this moment, some attacks, wars, conflict between countries at the bilateral and multilateral platforms across the world. Journalists suffer a lot. Many people suffer, but as journalists remain in the forefront as the human rights defenders, they suffer a lot, along with any challenges that the globe face at any moment, be that of the political turmoil and transition, or that of the natural disaster and pandemic or endemic, because they have responsibility to disseminate information. So we'll discuss at this moment how the international agencies, for example, United Nations, coming up with the idea of overcoming safety challenges that journalists face today. Few terminologies here I'm sharing with you. Media ethics. And it is aspirational, value-based. This is something journalists and media people decide what to write and what not to write, what to do and what not to do. And there are different, philosophies across the world. There are different conceptual framework about what could define as a media ethics according to the political system across the world. But the United Nations state members, the member states, countries agree upon some points. The discussion about media ethics that started from early 1920s, along with the introduction of ASME canon of journalism, which is popularly known as American Society of Newspaper Editors, come up with some points, some 7 specific points, ranging from freedom of press to responsibility to accuracy to decency, not harming anyone. So yes, media ethics is aspirational, it is value-based, and sometimes very difficult to measure. But this is the guiding principle of any code of conduct that any country context set up with. Some countries across the world, actually most countries across the world, do have press councils and media councils these days, and they come up with certain journalist code of conduct. But developed countries, some of the developed countries across the world, where relatively press freedom is better compared to other countries across the world, they come up with the idea of self-regulation kind of things. So they encourage journalists to be to maintain self-regulations. Then there are regulatory bodies as well. The regulation in particular is introduced and enforced by authority, semi-judicial, judicial, state authorities and all. And censorship, another terminology, is a prohibition or a suppression by authority about the media content, what to be written, what to be disseminated. There is another terminology connected to the exercise of journalistic work, and sometimes it is very closely related to media ethical criticism as well. So deliberate manipulation of expression out of fear, inclination, admiration, without explicit pressure from any specific party or institution, the authority or institution. So let me go this way. Journalists are criticized for being inclined to the political power centers, business power centers. Sometimes they are criticized for taking side of some religious fundamentalist as well. So it is high time for any journalist across the world to check whether they exercise self-censorship or not. There should not be an environment where journalists could go with self-censorship. So you are not facing any direct attacks, but you fear of something. Sometimes some motivations, sometimes some threats, sometimes some consequences, and you censor yourself. You don't want to disseminate a particular piece of information out of fear and inclination, your affiliations to the power centers. So it is high time to define how journalists' code of conduct across the world work. It is high time for journalists and media workers, the online news portals, and any form of media platforms, including that of the digital platform, that they are not inclined to any political, business, religious power centers if they don't want to self-censor themselves. Media control, the another terminology which looks into the power of news critically and try to control the content that is being disseminated by media outlets. Regulation, it is repeated, sorry. Ombudsperson, very traditional exercise of the looking into the complaint mechanism. A person appointed in the newsroom or by media outlets, newspapers, traditionally newspapers, which still exist in the United States, maybe 2-3% of the newspapers today in the United States and some of the countries across the world exercise ombudsperson, a person investigating and settling complaints, in-house procedure. This could be applied across the world, and it depends upon whether media outlets are able to allocate resources for this. These are some of the terminologies. Let's check. Globally, there are a lot of code of conduct introduced, as I was referring to American Society of Newspaper Editors in early 1920s. Then during the 40s, alongside much exploration and discussion about the social responsibility theory of communication, press, a commission was established at the Chicago University in the United States called Hutchins Commission, which came up with some global recommendations outlining the ethical standards for journalists, what to do and what not to do. That created a global discussion, dialogue among scholars, students and teachers and researchers, and also media workers and journalists about the role and responsibility of journalists in the democratic nations, which actually replaced the traditional role of communication alongside democratic or liberal theory of the press. And later in 80s, United Nations agencies, for example, UNESCO introduced with the Global Journalist Code of Ethics, and which today are reflect into the National Journalist Code of Conduct prepared by almost all countries across the world, some other way. There is reflection of those principles, the fair play, accuracy, balance, credibility. Now, alongside the issues of diversity and pluralism, there are some specific journalist code of conduct. For example, here in Nepal, the journalist code of conduct implemented and introduced by Press Council Nepal that talks about 14 do's and 14 don'ts by media houses and journalists. And these are the reflections of the global media ethics, discussions throughout these all decades. Media ethics, the study and application of the norms of journalism. Because journalism is considered as a profession of courage and conviction. And if you do not allow yourself to control your emotions, your inclination, your affiliation with the power centers, there are high chances that you disseminate distorted information. And alongside that distorted information, you put your credibility in question. So it is high time for journalists across the world to remember that media ethics is actually implemented in the newsrooms. And if there is a culture of self-regulations, there could be very less organization or no organizations asking media outlets to follow journalist code of conduct. But today, this norms, the terminology, media ethics confront the most important question that has been around contemporary practice, whether the ethical principles that have been in discussions for a long time have been in practice or not. Also, the evolution of a digital media today, there is global presence of any media content, radio, television, newspaper, convergence medium. They have been disseminating their content through the internet, the web pages, and now they are officially registered according to the national laws across the world, online news portals. And there is a global presence with multimediality, interactivity allowed. But alongside this evolution of a digital media that is at the global reach, use and impact anyone can access, it directly impacting the way information is being disseminated. There are less verification techniques, approaches being used by journalists, and in the name of becoming first, the information is being disseminated without appropriate processing, and which I consider a very big problem to the global media fraternity, which we need to deal together. It is actually also inviting safety threats for journalists when you do not process your information, edit your information, and verify information. That there are high chances for you to be, putting yourself into the safety threats. Media ethics, once a relatively homogeneous set of norms backed by mainstream professionals, threatens to fragment into rival sets of values adopted by various media practitioners today. It was homogeneous at the beginning, backed by mainstream media professionals. This terminology, sometimes I would like to say a so-called term, mainstream. But yes, today it is because of the fragmentation, as I earlier told, inclination of journalists, now values that have been adopted by the global journalistic practice. There are different associations, for example, International Federation of Journalists, the global umbrella organization of around 600,000 journalists across the world. They have also called for journalists to abide by some international principles of journalism. And almost there is good reflection of these global journalistic ethical principles to the National Journalist Code of Conduct, be they implemented by the organizations like press councils and media councils, or exercised by the professional associations, for example, associations of radio, television, online, and sometimes by newsrooms. They are also trying to set up with some good examples, appointing the traditional exercise, we call it ombudsperson. But equally, there are some challenges as well. The big question today is media ethics confronts a very difficult question. That is, what are the principles and practices that define responsible journalism in a digital media world? And I will try to respond this question alongside showing connection of media ethics to the safety of journalists. When media is ethical, the role of watchdog would be strengthened, because media is also known as watchdog. It watches upon the wrongdoings of, say, state agencies, for example, judiciary, executives, legislatives. And some has very rightly said that this is a fourth state, but this has been misinterpreted by the, by some organizations and individuals across the world. Also, this part of the world I stay in, South Asia or Nepal, that I would rather say journalism is not actually the fourth step. There is no legal recognition of journalism being the fourth state. This is a terminology used by one of the parliamentarians in the British Parliament during 1880s, that journalism should be regarded as the fourth state, because they watch upon the remaining three state organs, their wrongdoings, and they play the role of check and balance. So there are quite big challenges. Responsible journalism, alongside invention of these digital platforms, there are high chances for journalists or communicators to disseminate information that could attack the individual integrity of the people, the minority people. And often information disseminators do not take care of the diversity and pluralism issues. There are criticisms over media content, that these contents are attacking upon the dignity of women, particularly female. And there are a lot of examples across the world of the gendered disinformation. So misleading news also comes to the notion of media ethics today. And now, alongside the invent of electronic media, especially internet medium, journalists working across any type of media outlets need to take extra attention about how their information should be disseminated. the interest of minority, the interest of people with disability, the interest of the LGBTIQ, the interest of transgender people, and anyone that are very curious to listen about your message or learn through newspapers and other media outlets about what you communicate among them. I'm through this slide presenting you three major areas of concern at the global level. Because of the time, I'm not going through all journalists' code of conduct, but how journalists' code of conduct and how ethical principles and standards could be reflected in any setup across the world. Understanding standards appropriate to responsible and accountable journalism. There are different theories of praise, a terminology called consequentialism that talks about how media disseminate its information and what are the consequences around. If you are able to check it, and if you are able to check that you are actually not harming anyone through your media content, do it. But you must be very aware about that. And especially when you deal with your news source and you disseminate it to the public, you must check in mind the very public interest in that context. If you do not take care about the public interest and you just disseminate in the name of some information being truth, that could harm our society. The second area of concern in any media ethical discussion across the world is a critical application of standards to problems of practice. I would see, and I'm not surprised to see that journalists talking about their role, and they often talk about to follow media ethics, but I'm not sure that other professions also do indulge into violation of their code of conduct, their professional ethics. But I'm aware, and I have been engaged in many research, many studies across the world, some part of the world, but mostly in South Asia and Southeast Asia. What we see is, yes, we do not look into the ethical aspects as per the standards and their linkage with the problems of practice. The third point is development of moral character, so journalists are disposed to follow the principles. It is a very frequent reminder to journalists by sometimes by mostly by the regulatory mechanisms. For example, press councils and media councils reminding journalists to follow self-regulatory mechanisms. These are regulatory bodies, but they are actually encouraging journalists to be self-regulatory. And if journalists, editors, news media, and media workers, they are in a stage to follow journalistic code of conduct themselves, I think there will be these media councils or press councils would not be in existence. Why does safety matter? One way to follow ethical journalism is to make the watchdog role of media powerful. That is very important, one thing. And the next reason why media should be ethical and they follow the ethical standards in any setup is to make themselves safe and not to invite the safety threats. But we have to also understand the very notions of safety. Why does it matter to other than journalists? Because the issue of journalist safety is critical to their well-being, active agents in social and public life for the promotion of freedom of expression. We as individuals cannot reach out to the public directly. Actually, all individuals, citizens, public, whosoever, they actually reach out and share their concerns to authorities, any organizations, individuals, state agencies through media outlets. So actually media people and journalists are the agents in social and public life by disseminating information, providing platforms to journalists, other than journalists, people, and also disseminating critical aspects through opinion and editorial type of content, discussions, insights through media outlets. So if they are safe, they will be able to represent you as a whole, your diversity, your interest, your belongings. And if journalists cannot exercise freedom of expression in the safety and provision that guarantees such freedom is of a little value. There are global instruments. There are global instruments. The United Nations has been calling upon its member states to, follow these, ratify these, accede these, or at least remain, show some moral support to these international treaties. For example, Nepal is a state party to several international treaties, more than 24, 25 international treaties, including optional protocols and all, including that of the ICCPR, the Article 19, which talks about free expression. There is continuous aggressions against media professionals, and the failure to bring the culprits to justice obstructs the establishment of sustainable peace and the rule of law. When there is continuous attacks, we see these days across the world, maybe those who are listening me, maybe you are aware about the global, political situation at this moment. Say, for example, in Ukraine, a lot of international media rights organizations, they are focusing their programs and intervention in Ukraine, ensuring that journalists working in Ukraine, or even some part of the Russia, where a lot of information sources have been blocked. If journalists are not safe, and if justice is not provided, somehow other way, almost all countries across the world went through some sort of conflict. Take an example of Nepal. We overcome 10 years long conflict 15 or 16, 17 years ago. But still there impact of the 10 years long conflict here in Nepal. Many journalists who are killed by that time. Say, for example, an official record of the Federation of Nepali Journalists, 35 journalists were killed, 4 journalists went missing. We have also been working in these areas for Media Action Nepal, and in my personal capacity as a researcher, we often see that the agencies here in Nepal are unable to address the root cause of impunity, and they are thus unable to establish a sustainable peace, and victims have never been provided with the justice. Perpetrators have never been booked. Same is the case with the global phenomenon. We have seen journalists have been, intimidated, attacked, threatened in Afghanistan in the recent setup when Taliban took over. A lot of cases around. Whenever there comes conflict, some sort of war between two countries, or in border issues and anything else, it is very important for any nations to ensure that safety of journalists is, actually respected, and thus any nation can establish a sustainable peace. And when there is sustainable peace and rule of law, it would ultimately prosper the democratic norms across the world. This instrument, actually, I have already mentioned. I will briefly touch upon one of the instruments here. Is United Nations has come 10 years ago in 2012, and that has been fortunately implemented here in Nepal as well by UNESCO. And I was also working with UNESCO by that time. We implemented a very ambitious program of the United Nations here in Nepal alongside other countries in South Asia and Latin America, including Mexico and South Sudan, then Iraq and Pakistan and Nepal initially. And 2 weeks ago, we organized UNESCO, National Human Rights Commission, and some other organizations together organized a South Asian level conference about safety of journalists to review the United Nations plan of action on safety of journalists and the issue of impunity, where I had an opportunity to deliver remarks on behalf of the Media Freedom Coalition Consultative Network, also representing Media Action Nepal. What we see that, that United Nations very strong document, it's been 10 years, that presented with some idea about establishing national mechanisms across the world, and wherever that plan has been implemented. And there have been some efforts establishing such mechanisms which could look after the protection of free expression and safety of journalists alongside its commitments to international treaties that I have been showing through these slides, particularly the Article 19 of the ICCPRs that requires states to guarantee everyone the right to freedom of expression, including freedom to seek, receive, and impart information or ideas of any kind. But at the same time, there are national laws, fundamental rights provisions in almost all constitutions across the world, which are democratic in nature. Actually, there are some problems where democratic system does not actually exist. I'm not going through this because of the time constraint, but yes, this slide is available if you want to use. Yeah, international humanitarian law is another international document that warring parties or any conflicting parties need to take care in mind while treating with journalists and media professionals, any associated personnel specifically protected by IHL as civilians, provided they take no action adverse to this status. The United Nations Security Council has reaffirmed these obligations through resolutions on the protection of journalists in armed conflict. UNESCO's role, 1970s, many intense debates about the protection of journalists covering conflict situations. Then 2012, 10 years back, I already talked about this. The General Assembly introduced with a very ambitious program, which has some good impact across the world, but equally there is voice by the media rights civil society organizations to review this document to make contextual in the change context. For example, 15 years back, the issues of physical attacks were pertinent here in Nepal. Now, the issues of professional safety are more important. The gender disinformation is more important. The problem associated with safety of journalists are more ethical in nature today. That's why I have tried my best to connect these two issues together: safety of journalists and ethical performance of the media. Three-part test. There are always restrictions by state agencies stating that something disseminated by a journalist, attacks upon the integrity of a nation. But yes, those who are parties to the ICCPR and other international treaties defining freedom of expression, because it is broad, but Article 9, Clause 3, Section 3 of the ICCPR provides for its restriction in limited circumstances. If a nation has to put some restriction on some sort of content during the time of conflict or any time, they should take care of these reflections if they are party to these international treaties. Three-part test. Okay. Resolutions on the safety of journalists committee states, depending on their existing international human rights law obligations. And there are three important issues that any nation should take care in mind, any organization, nation other than journalists: prevention, protection, prosecution, and remedy. 3 P's actually. Prevention, we have to check whether appropriate prevention techniques are applied. What has been done for the protection of journalists, legal reforms may be one issue, and prosecution and remedy. We need to ensure that there are immediate, effective, independent court trials against any alleged perpetrators of media rights violations or crimes against journalists. And if that happens, that could possibly protect journalists from any vulnerable situation. And how can we start with the strategies in prevention techniques? By creating and maintaining a free and safe enabling environment for journalists and civil society organizations working for free press, condemn all attacks against journalists and the prevailing impunity. Now we can see the global examples that of Ukraine and some other part of the world, how journalists have been attacked. We have seen some incident in the Palestine a few weeks ago, the tension between Israel and Palestine, journalists associating with the Al Jazeera, female journalist has been killed, another injured. I mean, there must be some sort of solidarity among the nations advocating free press condemning such type of attacks at any point of time. Refrain from intimidating or threatening the media and journalists. The derogatory language being used, especially in relations to the gender disinformation. Refrain from the misuse of overbroad or vague laws to replace legitimate expressions. Now we see often countries coming up with the laws, including Nepal, trying to attempt control the online platform, including that of the Google platform, Facebook, or other social media, YouTubes, and Twitters, limiting their expansion. And journalists are the first victims. So we need to check, as the global, regional, or national organizations working for the safety of journalists, we need to check whether countries abide by their commitments to their own constitutional provisions and also to the international commitments they have done throughout different times. Ensure business entities and individuals are not using strategic lawsuits against public participation to exercise pressure on journalists. The only legal source of journalism is advertisement, but there are ethics for advertisement as well. Media sometimes is highly criticized for being unethical while projecting advertorials, and most often the advertorial relating to the entertainment industry not gender sensitive. So you have to check these, business entities or any individuals trying to, use strategic lawsuits against public participation in exercise pressure on the journalist. Also, the second point is protection mechanism, establishing early warning and rapid response mechanism against threats. The idea of establishing national mechanism by the United Nations Plan of Action is to address this issue of the protection. But unfortunately, very few countries across the world do have that kind of mechanism that works effectively. And also taking measures to address sexual harassment and other forms of sexual and gender-based violation. Because we're doing these days, we carried out a research called Gender Sensitivity in Nepali Media, observed around 24,000 news stories. The research result is available in our website, Media Action Nepal, also in English language, that we analyze these stories, and we have seen that, the issues of gender-based violence have very, very, hardly reported in line with the national and international human rights, gender rights issues. And the space given to journalists reporting on these issues need to be reviewed. Protecting journalists, in particular, those covering protest and elections taking place across the world. Protests are also there because conflict is part and parcel of our life. And who suffer? Journalists suffer. And we must protect journalists, in particular, those covering protest and elections. Now, maybe, disaster as well sometimes. Allow encryption and anonymity, and refrain from employing unlawful or arbitrary surveillance techniques. Because journalism is not spying, and journalists, they don't actually principally engage in spying. They do journalism with their courage and conviction to the principles of, free press, accountable media. Problems are everywhere. All we need to do is to remind them, create awareness. A lot of digital literacy is required because very few people across the world are digitally literate. Protect journalists' confidential sources. There are sometimes authorities coming up with the laws. For example, I remember a law prepared in Pakistan many years ago when Pervez Musharraf, as director rule, took over the powers, introduced a law called compelling broadcast journalists to, mention their sources. So the confidential sources of news should be protected, even by authorities, because journalists, they come into contact with many type of sources, and they have to protect their confidential sources as well. The state should not compel them to disclose. Enhance information gathering and monitoring mechanisms, also those by civil society organizations. Finally, prosecution and remedy is very important. When perpetrators are booked, punished, or fairly independently prosecuted, I think there will be a very impartial and prompt, thorough, independent, and effective investigation to all alleged violence, threats, and attacks. This will create enabling environment for journalists, and they would automatically follow the journalist code of conduct as well. There will be less tension among journalists, and the messages they disseminate is being received by the recipient. Create special investigative units or independent commissions, and consider appointing a special prosecutor. This is another way investigations could be done. Adopt specific gender-sensitive protocols and methods of investigation and prosecution. Support capacity building, training, awareness raising, particularly in line with, in relations to the presence of digital media platforms, their use, their access, their impact to the lives of individuals, particularly minority people, including women. Ensure that victims and their families have access to appropriate restitution, compensation, and assistance. This applies especially in relations to the conflict and war zone. I thought you would be joining me in Zoom as well. So I prepared a slide about question, but I think there are no questions as such. And here I come to the end of my presentation. I would like to thank all of you for listening me in the Facebook page, I trust, that of International Intensive University. And I also take this opportunity to thank International Intensive University's Vice Chancellor, Madam Corina, and all personalities associated with this university. With this note, I would like to stop myself here. Hope you have enjoyed my presentations. Thank you very much.